Tonight, we begin with 3 words that changed the calculation for every Russian military planner. 3 words from Donald Trump that eliminated the one assumption Russian generals had been counting on. 3 words that forced an emergency reassessment of Russia's entire strategic posture toward NATO. When asked whether NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft entering their airspace, Trump didn't equivocate, he didn't hedge, he didn't leave room for interpretation. He said, yes, they should. That answer reverberated through the halls of the Russian Ministry of Defense like an earthquake. Because for months, Russian military planners had been operating under the belief that Trump would be the wedge that split NATO, that his transactional approach to alliances would create daylight between Washington and European capitals, that his skepticism about Article 5 commitments would give Russia room to test boundaries without triggering unified alliance response. Trump's 3-word answer destroyed that assumption completely, and it forced Russian commanders to confront a terrifying reality. There is no longer any ambiguity about NATO's willingness to use lethal force against Russian provocations. Within 72 hours of Trump's statement, intelligence agencies monitoring Russian military communications detected something unprecedented: emergency consultations between field commanders and the general staff, urgent briefings at the Ministry of Defense, and most significantly, a series of what can only be described as interventions, where senior Russian military officers pushed back directly against Putin's aggressive posturing toward NATO. Not in public, not in press conferences, but in the secure briefing rooms where Russia's war strategy is actually decided. The message Russian commanders delivered was stark and unambiguous. Continuing to test NATO boundaries is no longer a calculated risk, it's suicide. Poland has announced it will shoot down violating aircraft without waiting for alliance approval. Trump has confirmed the United States supports that decision. NATO has deployed operational plans for moving 800,000 troops across Europe if Russia attacks any member state. And most critically, the strategic ambiguity that Russia relied on to exploit divisions within the alliance has been eliminated. NATO isn't debating anymore, it's prepared to act, and Russian commanders understand what that means. Let me explain why Trump's statement was the catalyst that changed everything. For 3 years, Russian strategy toward NATO rested on a simple calculation: push hard enough to intimidate, but not so hard that you trigger Article 5, test the boundaries, probe the defenses, violate airspace with drones and aircraft, launch cyber attacks on infrastructure, sabotage undersea cables, all of it carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold where NATO would be forced to respond collectively. The strategy worked because NATO spent months debating each incident. Was it serious enough to invoke Article 5? Should individual members respond, or should the alliance coordinate? How do you prove attribution for cyber attacks and sabotage? The endless deliberations gave Russia time to act with impunity. Trump eliminated those deliberations with one answer. When the President of the United States says NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft, he's not offering an opinion, he's announcing policy. And when that policy is shoot first, coordinate later, every Russian operational plan built on the assumption of NATO hesitation becomes obsolete overnight. Russian commanders had to brief Putin on the implications. They had to explain that the entire strategic framework for engaging NATO, the framework that assumed Western democracies would be too divided, too cautious, too risk-averse to respond decisively, had collapsed. They had to present intelligence showing Poland positioning air defense systems with orders to engage any unauthorized aircraft. They had to show him satellite imagery of NATO's forward deployment, troops and equipment moving east in quantities that haven't been seen since the Cold War. And they had to deliver the assessment that continuing provocations under these new conditions wouldn't achieve strategic objectives. It would trigger the war Russia cannot win. This wasn't easy. Putin's entire political identity is built on projecting strength, on never backing down to Western pressure, on demonstrating that Russia is a great power that makes other countries adjust to Russian interests, not the other way around, being told by his own generals that he needs to de-escalate, that he needs to stop testing NATO, that continuing his current approach will lead to catastrophic consequences. That's not a message any autocrat wants to hear, especially not from the military officers who are supposed to be implementing his vision, not questioning it. But Russian commanders weren't questioning out of political opposition. They were questioning out of professional military judgment. They understand capabilities. They understand force ratios. They understand that Russia's army is already stretched impossibly thin trying to make minimal gains in Ukraine. They know desertion rates have reached crisis levels. They see the equipment shortages, the ammunition constraints, the logistics nightmares. And they understand that if NATO enters this war, even in a limited capacity, the Russian military doesn't have the resources to fight on 2 fronts. The numbers are devastating. Russia has committed essentially its entire deployable ground force to Ukraine. The units not actively engaged are either reconstituting after catastrophic losses or protecting other borders. There is no strategic reserve. There is no depth. If NATO forces engage Russian units anywhere along Russia's western border, there are no additional forces to commit without withdrawing troops from Ukraine. And withdrawing troops from Ukraine means losing whatever territorial gains have been achieved at such enormous cost. It's a trap of Russia's own making. Russian commanders had to present these realities to Putin in stark terms. They had to explain that Trump's statement wasn't just rhetoric. It represented a fundamental shift in NATO's operational posture from reactive to proactive, from defensive to potentially offensive, and they had to make clear that under these new conditions, Russian provocations wouldn't demonstrate strength. They'd demonstrate Russia's inability to back up its threats when called on them. The internal debate within the Russian military establishment has become intense. Hardliners argue that backing down to NATO pressure makes Russia look weak and emboldens Ukraine to continue resisting. They claim that showing restraint will be interpreted as capitulation and will undermine Putin's domestic position. But operational commanders, the officers actually responsible for executing military operations, are pushing back hard. They're arguing that looking weak is better than being destroyed. That strategic patience is smarter than tactical aggression when you're outgunned. That Russia needs to consolidate gains in Ukraine rather than opening new fronts it cannot sustain. But what makes this moment so significant is that the operational commanders are winning this argument. For the first time since the invasion began, Putin appears to be listening to military advice that contradicts his political instincts. Recent Russian provocations have decreased in frequency and intensity. The airspace violations that were happening weekly have dropped off. The aggressive naval maneuvers near NATO maritime borders have been scaled back. The hybrid warfare operations continue, but they're more carefully targeted and less likely to trigger the kind of response Trump endorsed. This isn't Putin suddenly becoming cautious. This is Russian military commanders successfully convincing him that the risk-reward calculation has fundamentally changed. That Trump's warning, combined with NATO's operational preparations, means the old playbook doesn't work anymore. That Russia needs to focus on securing its position in Ukraine rather than expanding confrontation with an alliance that has demonstrated it's prepared to fight. But here's the danger. The restraint is fragile. It's based on calculations, not principles. Russian commanders are urging caution because they believe NATO will actually respond to provocations now. If that belief changes, if Russia starts to think Trump's warning was empty, or if NATO shows hesitation in some future incident, the provocations will resume. This isn't a strategic shift born of changed Russian intentions. It's tactical adjustment born of fear of NATO's response. Western intelligence agencies understand this. They're tracking Russian military communications carefully, looking for signs that the restraint is weakening. They're monitoring whether Russian commanders maintain their influence over Putin's decision-making or whether hardliners push for renewed aggression. And they're preparing for the possibility that Russia will test NATO's resolve again, perhaps in ways designed to probe whether Trump's endorsement of lethal force was genuine or political theater. NATO's response has been to reinforce the message at every level. Poland hasn't backed away from its shoot-down authorization. The United States continues moving equipment east. Military exercises along NATO's eastern border have increased in frequency and scale. The alliance is demonstrating through actions, not just words, that Trump's warning represents actual policy, that any Russian provocation will be met with immediate response, that the era of endless NATO deliberations while Russia acts with impunity is over. For Russian commanders, this creates enormous pressure. They understand they bought Putin some time by convincing him to reduce provocations, but they also know Putin's political instincts will eventually push him toward renewed aggression. He can't maintain his strongman image indefinitely while appearing to accommodate Western demands. At some point, he'll need to demonstrate that Russia hasn't been deterred, that NATO's warnings don't control Russian decision-making, that he's still the leader who does what he wants regardless of Western threats. When that moment comes, Russian commanders will face an impossible choice. Follow Putin's orders and risk triggering the NATO response they've spent months warning him about, or refuse those orders and face the consequences of military insubordination in Putin's Russia. That choice, that moment of decision, is what Western strategists are most concerned about, because it will determine whether Trump's warning achieved lasting deterrence or just delayed the inevitable confrontation. Tonight, Russian military commanders have successfully urged Putin to avoid NATO clash. They've convinced him for now that continuing provocations under current conditions leads to catastrophe, but the underlying tensions haven't been resolved. Russia still wants to intimidate NATO. Putin still needs to project strength domestically. And Russian military strategy still depends on the belief that Western alliances will eventually fracture under pressure. Trump's warning changed the immediate calculus. It forced Russian restraint, but it didn't change Russian intentions. And that means the real test is still coming.